You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. From Mamamia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, which is a podcast where I talk to a person about something interesting. Imagine that. Never before been done on the internet. In all seriousness, though, thank you for lending me your ears, and I promise that I will not waste that valuable resource. Because after listening to this episode, you're going to go away feeling lighter, maybe even happier, and certainly more optimistic. Because you're about to hear about grace, the act of grace, not the person. The person you're going to hear from is Julia Baird, who isn't just an award-winning journalist. She's also a world-famous and best-selling author of many non-fiction books about things like feminism and Queen Victoria and phosphorescence, and most recently, Bright Shining, her book about grace. Julia has an incredible knack for knowing what we need to read about before we even know that we need it. And it's not just because she's faced down some impossibly dark times in her own life. Bright Shining has landed at a time when the news cycle has brought more horror into our eyes and our ears than in living memory. Doom scrolling has never felt more distressing or depressing, which is why this book and the conversation about it that you're about to hear feels exactly like that. A bright shining light in the dark that's always there. You just need to know where to look for it. Today, we're going to talk about grace, what it means, who practices it, how to nurture it, and what happens when people don't. Here's Julia Baird and the most beautiful conversation about grace. Jules, tell me about the Brazilian nurses during COVID.
So, as you would remember, one of the very worst things about COVID was the fact that when people were really ill or were dying, they could not be with their loved ones in hospital. And nurses themselves reported feeling really quite traumatised by that because they were just watching people suffer on their own. And there were these two Brazilian nurses in Sao Paulo who talked about it in their lunch break, talked about this old method they'd once heard about. And they went back into the wards and they got these gloves, rubber gloves, filled them with like really warm water, tied the top of them together and slid hands through it of people who were really ill. So it was a glove on the bottom and a glove on the top, and it felt like they called it the hands of love. It felt like someone's holding your hand, that someone's with you, and immediately they noticed that their vitals had improved, that these people were instantly responding to that kind of pressure and that kind of company, even it was the most simple gesture. And I think you have to understand how desperate those times were to see how much that actually meant. And there was a little news story that just kind of then sparked around the world, which they were amazed by. And again, I think we were looking for times of tenderness, and we were just seeing so much hard work and so much thought from a lot of medical staff who briefly and appropriately received the kind of applause they should always be receiving. And I got in contact with them with the help of my Brazilian friend Susanna and asked them about it and that experience and why they did it and what it had been like since. And they were just two beautiful women. They were like, well, you know, like we all talk about empathy, but we really have to get that off the page and put it into your lives. And that person in front of you could have been, it's someone's brother or mother or sister or neighbour or loved one, and we just acted towards them as they would have. So it was just like, that to me is such a beautiful moment of grace, which I think you see so much in the medical profession, because they don't stop and say, do I like this person? Do I agree with their political views? You know, how did they vote in the last election? There's a need and they try to meet it in another human.
I want to ask you more about nurses because you write about them a lot and I know you've experienced the grace of nurses a lot. When I first heard that you were writing a book about grace, I thought, oh shit, she's going to make me read about nature. Because I know you love nature.
Yeah, I've done that once.
And I did love phosphorescence. It was beautiful. And I thought grace and nature. But that's not what this book is about. That's not what Bright Shining is about. That's not about that kind of grace.
Yep.
What is grace to you in the context of this book?
So when you ask people what grace is, it's very much people are confused or they think it's like a Hallmark card kind of sentiment, like something really sweet, something that your grandmother would have along with her talcum powder. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
and it almost can feel a bit anti-feminist, like
Yes.
women should have grace, like June Daly Watkins, a woman walking with a book on her
be
head.
obedient.
Yes,
and
using the right
elegant.
fork.
Don't offend anyone.
Yeah.
Be super nice and suck up all the stuff you have to deal with, right, which you shouldn't be having to deal with. I don't see it like that at all. When you look at the way writers and thinkers have addressed grace, it's always got an element of mystery about it. We don't really understand it, but we see it when it happens. And I think that's because it's fundamentally not tit for tat, eye for eye, like seeking revenge. It's breaking those kinds of cycles. So
And it's not transactional.
No, it's not. And it's not because someone deserves it. It's mercy, not merit. It essentially is undeserved.
What does that mean, mercy, not merit? Can you explain
So
that?
you're not saying, if someone, paramedic goes to someone's house, they've had a heart attack and they go, oh, well, he hasn't paid his taxes for 3 years and honestly he's arguing with his daughter a bit lately and he's got hygiene problems. I think maybe we'll just let this one slide, go to the next house. Like it's looking after people irrespective of whether or not they deserve it.
Yeah, right.
Whether they're worthy of it. Or forgiving someone who might have done something that seems to be unforgivable. And I do struggle with forgiveness a lot in this book, very openly. Loving someone who's unlovable. But when we see that, when we see something that goes beyond just being good and just being kind and like not that I'm dismissing those things, they're great, it's really arresting. And it's like a form of awe. So Daka Keltner, who's an expert in awe, he's been studying it for decades and really thinks this is the secret to happiness, did a survey of 26 countries and a bunch of people obviously in those countries and found that the most common thing that they all had across kind of languages and cultures and histories, the number one thing in which people found awe was not art or cathedrals or nature, for you.
Few.
Or what you might expect. In sport, you find a lot of awe. The number one thing was seeing acts of great kind of decency or generosity in other people, seeing what I like to call moral beauty in other people. So it's something that we do fundamentally understand when we see it.
I'm going to mangle this quote, but it makes me think of that line about when things look incredibly bleak or when there's a big tragedy or a catastrophe, look for the helpers. When it just feels like, after a terrorist attack and all you can see is the evil that happened and you look, like after 9/11, you look at the first responders and the firefighters that rushed into that building.
That's it.
Is that what grace is?
Yeah. Someone asked me, what is it, the emotion that you feel when with grace? And I think it's for me, it's a fundamental relief that humans can be like this. That this is why we're here, because when it comes down to it and in the midst of the ugliness and the horror and all the crap we have to deal with, still people care for each other at the point of exhaustion, fight fires to the point of exhaustion. Still people sing when the world is silent. Still people love. Still people take risks for each other. And that is fundamentally what it means to be on this earth, like why we want to stay here on this earth, because we have that. And that's what can heal rifts. That's what can break cycles of conflict. That's what can fundamentally change so many things, but also our own health, like all the metrics that show, what happens to your body when you forgive, what happens to your heart rate, your pulse, as well as self-reported levels of contentment when you give people the benefit of the doubt is really, really fascinating.
The opposite of the benefit of the doubt, obviously, is cancel culture.
Yep.
I've been thinking about this a lot. There's no grace in cancel culture because it's all about piling onto someone who's made a mistake. In most cases, it's an inadvertent mistake.
Yep.
I'm not talking about people who've committed crimes or Harvey Weinstein. That's different.
Yep.
But someone who has inadvertently done something that's offended someone or a group of people and everyone piles on. And you can see that in most cases we know that people can be suicidal, they can have terrible consequences from that. As everyone says, you've got to be accountable, you've got to be accountable. There's no grace in that, is there?
I think there's something about, again, not always giving people the benefit of the doubt, but knowing that you yourself have said stupid things, done stupid things, made mistakes, held dodgy attitudes. Like you've got to hold on to the belief that we
use
can be
words that are terrible.
But people can be persuaded. People can change. People can move to a place where they understand better what another person's lived experience might be. And before that, you might say stupid things. So I think there's a question of not giving up on that. Like, I've written biography as well, and I've studied a lot of history, and when you write these, you really wrestle with what is a person, because they can be capable of great tenderness and meanness all in the one day.
Yes.
Towards one person and not to another. You might be, Queen Victoria, incredibly generous to her servants who drank too much, incredibly strong on religious tolerance in India, but not so strong on the potato famine, and super critical of her own children. Like, you struggle with this as a biographer, how to make sense of it. And did she move beyond the attitudes of her times, or did she kind of soak them up? But I think it is about recognising other people's humanity. But I do also write about the fact that we have to see that there are some people who've always been forgiven for things.
It's the grace that you allow, that you give someone, particularly if you're the person who's offended. I'm not talking about the virtue signaler on social media, but if you are part of a group perhaps that was inadvertently offended, and grace might be you saying, okay, I accept your apology. I accept that you understand that it was not the right word to use, or not the right joke to make, or
if you believe
whatever.
It's a genuine apology and there's genuine remorse, you can probably move on from that point.
You talk about loving the unlovable and forgiving the unforgivable. Your mother worked in prisons, and she worked in some of the toughest women's prisons. Tell me about her experience with Catherine Knight.
So Mum was really the kind of person that always saw the best in people. And some of the women she worked with were quite transformed by the fact that they had a group of middle-aged women coming in, talking to them about things, running workshops on things like forgiveness. And they always struggled to forgive themselves, who literally baked them cakes or gave them hugs or did kind of
So your mum would volunteer in prisons?
Yep. She would say about some of these women, oh, it's amazing, I had this great time with, let's say, Sue, and she was singing away in the choir and doing all of this. And I'd be like, isn't that the one that decapitated her boyfriend? And she's like, yes, and she's so lovely. She could always see the best in someone, and something I always struggled with. But she had a moment with Catherine Knight. They actually spent quite a bit of time together.
Catherine Knight did actually decapitate and boil.
She skinned her partner alive and went to boil up the parts of him, was going to serve it up in a meal for the family, and was roasting parts of him as well. It was like a complete – I went back and read the judgment for this book, and it was a completely gruesome scene. But she just had this moment with her where they were just sitting and like talking one night, things that bothered them, things that burdened them, and Mum was saying, I really struggle. My mum was very devout, and she said that she struggles at night because she tries to like pray and go through the day, and she just falls asleep in the middle of when she's doing it. And Catherine was just like, it's okay. I think God would understand that you are exhausted and you're trying to do the best thing. And And it was like a weird moment that like Mum was vaguely comforted. I remember her coming back and going, oh, it was this really crazy moment I had with Catherine Knight. And I was like, okay, that's amazing because of what Catherine has done or was said to have been capable of. And yet they had this moment. So I tried to get in touch with Catherine for the book repeatedly, and it took me quite a while, but eventually I got a message passed through to her. And she just wrote back and said, I don't remember your mother, and which was so strange to me. And I'm like, it's funny because Mum's antenna was very open to what is the best in people. What is there in people that we have to hold on? Does anyone have anything redeeming at all?
Going back to what you just said, that doesn't surprise me at all that she didn't remember, because I think that the people who receive an act of grace, it changes them and it affects them.
Yeah.
It can affect them profoundly. The person that gives the grace, it's not as big a deal for them. So that doesn't surprise me.
Although it's just not behaviour that you would necessarily expect.
I think that that's also probably why it stood out for your mum.
Yeah.
But if that's who she has become, if she does that all the time and is capable of that, that was not a very memorable exchange, because she just saw someone who could benefit from an act of grace in that moment.
Yeah, wild to me. Then I started looking a lot at people on death row, and I'm really always been fascinated by the work of Sister Helen Prasian, who's in Dead Man Walking.
And what does she do?
She works with people who are on death row, and she's often pleading for either clemency. And in that movie where Susan Sarandon played her, she was dealing with a man who'd raped and killed And she was excoriated for it at the time. Why would you spend time? Why would you do all of this? But she knew this man was walking towards his death. And she wanted to try to find something good in him. And so she was looking for something she could hold on to. And day after day, he had no remorse. I don't think he even admitted to it most of the time. And then so she one day was saying, well, isn't there something that the family might get? And he said, yes, I think when I die, maybe that will give the family some peace. And she went, that's it. That's it. There's a glimmer of humanity in him. He's just thinking about another person because empathy is so core to all of this. And that's something I can work with. And she worked with that.
Do you mean that's something I can work with to build into?
To pull out something good in him.
The golden thread.
To pull out the golden thread and to make him think about other people. Finally. And I've gone through some of her recent applications for clemency for people on death row, which are not successful. Even when the governor of the state will say, look, this person has really reformed, this has been their time, what they've done in prison, this is how they've helped other people. And do you know what? In this man's bottle, when he was bottle fed as a baby, there was alcohol in it. That's how he grew up. He had no chance. Addiction was stitched into his infancy. So this man, who killed someone else in a drug-fueled rage. And I'm always interested in the possibility of transformation or redemption, but also people like Sister Helen who are looking for the glimmers. And that to me is the opposite of how we're always trying to look for what's the one little thing someone said and done wrong and magnify it. And so that just seems very countercultural to me, yeah.
Up next, Julia talks about grace within grief and what she did when a man that she loved and lived with for many years died in a plane crash. Stay with us. You wrote about losing a past partner, Morgan Mellish, who was very close to you. You guys were together for a really long time.
Yeah.
And you talk about how he died suddenly in a plane crash just after you'd married and had a baby and moved to the other side of the world. Where was the grace? You wrote beautifully about the hierarchy of grief. Where do you find grace within grief?
Everyone finds their own way. I think fundamentally you have to hold on to the good stuff that happened, and they did, and apply the urgency of living to your own life. Which is what a really great funeral can give you, what is a life well lived. The reason I wrote that chapter is because I read this poem by Jack Gilbert called Icarus Flew. And the idea being people always forget that before Icarus fell, he flew. And so often relationships are described as, it was a failed relationship because it didn't last, as opposed to, no, we had a few amazing years together. And then you work out it's not right and you have to make the really hard decision to say, this can't be forever. But then... And he says in the poem, he wasn't falling, he was coming to the end of his triumph. And I just love to think about relationships that way. That is how I think about some of my relationships that didn't endure and that, to me, there's a gentleness in that perspective as well.
Yeah.
And it's not all about loss. It's about looking back and seeing what you had and how incredibly lucky you are and how it's such a honor and responsibility to be with a person even if it's not going to be forever. To
walk together for a period of time.
Yeah, and look after each other. Yeah.
You met up with the woman who was his girlfriend at the time that he died.
Yeah.
What was that experience like?
Oh, that was amazing. I was in Ningaloo. I was in a writing frenzy fever dream in Ningaloo.
Writing about Grace?
Yeah, writing about Grace. Yeah.
And he was obviously on your mind.
Yeah. And then I just emailed her out of the blue.
Had you known each other?
Never. We never contacted each other, never anything before. But I'd watched during the funeral because it became such a big hoo-ha. It was a big, the Prime Ministers were at his funeral.
Because he was a journalist and he died while covering a prime ministerial visit to
Thailand,
Indonesia,
Prime Minister. And I watched the time that people kind of almost kept dismissing her. And I kept thinking,
why is that?
I don't know. Maybe it's because she was in Indonesia and there were, I don't know.
And they'd been together for
6 months.
6 months, yeah. So somehow her grief didn't count, that hierarchy of grief, right? So some people read it and made a leaderboard, which I do like leaderboards. Yeah. But on the top of that leaderboard, who was there? If there's no wife, who's
Right.
on the top, no children,
Right.
who's on the top of that leaderboard. I
Yeah.
guess his parents,
Yeah,
and then
sisters.
you factored in there because you were a
Well, I
very
was in another
significant
country,
partner.
but like that's why it's very weird as an ex.
And she slotted herself in.
She did. She took the microphone afterwards and said he was my partner and my editor, and I was so lucky to have known him. And she was just really beautiful woman, and I was struck by her. So I emailed her just to go, how are you now? And how was it dealing with that? And asked, are you okay? And within like a couple of hours or maybe less, there was this big warm email back in my inbox just saying, oh, it's so good to hear from you. Like, it took me ages. I had to move cities. And after 2 years, I started to feel better, but I was crying every day. And we started to correspond. And she was like, if you're ever in Perth, I'm here on a fellowship. And she has done amazing things. She's been an Atlantic Fellow, an Eisenhower Fellow. She's set up this series of non-profit libraries across Indonesia. Like, there's almost 200 or so of them now.
Wow.
In regional areas for kids. And we met up in Perth because I was flying back. I just happened to be there. Like 2 days later, we sat down together. And she was really lovely. And we spoke about what it means to have loved someone like that and to take the beauty from them, and to also, she says, I just doesn't wait to do things anymore. She had the idea for these libraries and she just went and did it. So, yeah, Neela.
Did you feel him there with the two of you?
I guess, in a sense, like, because we both had kind of unpolluted ideas of him. You know? Just a lot of sweetness and love, and which is what he's like. If I ever dream about him, he's always just this really beautiful, warm presence, which is great.
There's an enormous amount of grace at funerals. You see it a lot. Yeah.
Again, it'd be very difficult to put a word on it, but
Yeah.
like you
feel its presence.
Yeah.
It's hard to explain.
Yeah. Well, everything's stripped away and nothing else matters but each other at that point, I think.
You've spent a lot of time in hospital.
Yep.
You like a hospital.
I'm a frequent flyer.
You are.
I should have my own wing.
You write so beautifully about the grace of nurses
Yeah.
because the heroism of doctors is given so much space in our culture.
Yeah.
But the grace of nurses is not. Can you remember some of the incidents that you've witnessed or experienced the grace of nurses?
And it's by writing about them as well, like it's not meant to, like I had a really fantastic surgeon.
The surgeons are the main characters, right?
Yeah.
They get all the attention and the money
They
and the
come in
accolades
and
the
people scatter and everything has to go past them. And
but the nurses don't get any of that.
Oh, no. And you
And
get
yet-
to know them so well because I'm always there for about a month or so if I have a surgery, and like I really have to be pieced back together. Like you're very vulnerable. And the smallest of things, the smallest of like wrapping those hot blankets around your toes, of just tending to you, of just allowing your dignity to be intact, to, I tell the story about this time my kids came in to see me and I was really missing them, and they could only be with me for half an hour, and I just really felt like they'd just been ripped out of my arms, and I just really cried, and I hadn't cried for so long, and I really cried. And there was this nurse who just got my arm and he was rubbing it, this arm. He was rubbing it like really hard. He's going, but you're okay. You're a strong and intelligent woman, just like David Marr.
Wow.
Which I loved, which
David
I
Marr
tell
would love
David
that
about
too.
all
He
the
would love
time.
that.
Yeah. It was
He also is a strong and intelligent woman.
Right.
For anyone listening who doesn't know who David Marr is, he's a giant of journalism and just also a giant, just the most amazing, urbane, brilliant man.
Yeah.
And you are that.
He's written a book, Killing for Country, which is out now, which is fantastic. So, yeah.
So those acts of grace
Yep.
without
Checking
fanfare, without
Yep.
it's also going above and beyond, isn't it,
Yeah.
of what's expected.
Yep. It's so weird. You really form this very intense affection because I think you're just you're naked basically.
Yeah.
I remember when I wasn't allowed to have anything to drink and I was so parched. For like a couple of days. It felt like an eternity. I don't know how long it was. I was in ICU for like a week or something, and someone came and gave me an ice chip, and she's like, it was like an illegal. I actually shouldn't be doing it. And I can't tell you how good that ice chip was. And I was like so grateful.
And it imprints on you, doesn't it? It cracks your heart open a little bit.
It actually
An
does.
act of grace.
It does. And I write a lot about a woman called Laura Gilpin, who was a nurse, she was a poet that kind of became a nurse, who advocated for the needs of patients. And she's just, the way she writes about people with such tenderness and care. Sometimes you're walking with people, they're not even going to necessarily leave the hospital, but you were there. I've seen them be absolutely abused and continue to care for that person. I've seen people think they're on a cruise ship and get very confused and what am I going to do, and shouting at them, carrying on up and down the corridor. But they're still, the next day they'll still be feeding them, they'll still be wiping them, they'll still be tending to them. And again, it goes back to it's not like people deserve it. And yet there they are day after day. And it's the same with people who work with those with disabilities who are in aged care homes. I mean, those women who looked after my mother, like, amazing. Most of them were completely amazing. And even though I just remember the night that she died, and some of them were really quite upset. They were fond of her and they just kept bringing us bottles of wine. I don't know why they had so many.
Wine. That's an act of grace.
Yeah, exactly. But it was just so much empathy. It's like trying to anticipate your pain when you don't know how to articulate it, or you aren't even sure if you're feeling it anymore because you're so bombed out. It's just that seeking to comfort another person. It's like when you're constantly
seeking
needing
to comfort. Yeah, that's what it is, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
You've spent a lot of time with First Nations people. There was not a lot of grace in our recent referendum.
Yeah.
Very little grace shown to Indigenous people. What have you learned about grace from the people you've spent time with, particularly from the stolen generation that you write about?
So I was struggling a lot with the idea of forgiveness because I've also worked a lot with survivors of domestic abuse. So I know that forgiveness is weaponised, often in faith communities. So the idea that, say in some faith communities, you have to forgive and forgive and forgive and things will get better. There are some times when you just need to leave.
Because you've done an extraordinary investigation in domestic abuse in the church.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about that and how faith was weaponised against those victims?
Yeah. Well, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before and what people are expected to forgive. And if you continue to forgive certain things, then you just enable it. You don't see it as a particularly difficult or bad thing. And for a long time, women in the church have been told just forgive it and put up with it and pray for it, and that is your lot, which goes back to the idea of the caricature, which is keep sweet and obey.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. So they had to almost disentangle themselves because you want to forgive and think that it's all over and done with, but actually you can stay trapped in a dangerous situation or a highly unhealthy situation, which is toxic, which you might tear you to shreds.
And that can also mean that the perpetrator avoids any consequences because the onus is on the victim to keep forgiving.
And that's the crucial thing. When you place the burden on the victim, and the victim should be unburdened. That's really, I almost use that word instead of forgiveness half the time. It's an unburdening. You're not saying, oh, mate, you're right, you're tickety-boo because you murdered someone. You're saying whatever. You're saying, no, that what you did is wrong and there should be consequences for it and you should be remorseful for that, but I'm going to leave what you did to me at your door. But you can't put that expectation. I know a lot of survivors of domestic abuse and sexual assault feel a guilt and a struggle as though that's the imperative and that's the only way to get better again. But if we're living in a culture when those people who do that harm and commit those crimes are never brought to justice, then how can you forgive in that? You know what I mean? You can unburden yourself. So when I was thinking about and spending time with members of the stolen generations and First Nations people, I was really struck by the idea that for some, like Ray Minikin, who's a pastor, says, well, how can you forgive when you've still got an open wound? And that wound has only been worsened in recent times. Auntie Lorraine Peters, who was a Kuta girl in the Cootamundra home and survived very significant abuse, just said to me, I don't understand the word forgiveness. I just don't understand it. And yet Scott Morrison, who, and that's part of his faith tradition, said that on Sorry Day, that it's very hard, when he was Prime Minister, that it's hard to say sorry, but it's even harder to forgive, and that's what has to happen now. But a powerful white man saying that when so little has been done to achieve the reconciliation or the recognition or to address the harms and be honest about our history and what actually happened.
It's almost like demanding grace from someone else.
Right.
Yeah, or coercing grace out of them.
Exactly. Yeah. But then you get to you must be compliant and you must put up with your lot. And I see grace as very much entwined with a lot of movements towards justice, actually, and towards liberation of people. When I look at Auntie Lorraine, she is, like so many elders, she's got such a strong spirit. She spends her life running workshops with her daughter Shan on healing, helping to heal her mob and talking through intergenerational trauma and working with white people and educating, non-Aboriginal people as well. And to me, and she's got such a kind, strong way about her, to me she embodies grace by continuing to do that. That's where it's found. It's not in just saying, oh, right, okay, you find that all of that happened, the whole, massacres and dispossession and the impacts of colonisation. It's not saying that's fine at all.
Do you have some weird spidey sense, ability to tell the future? When you write a book, I know it's months out, but your books tend to be published at the two bleakest times in my living memory and probably yours. Phosphorescence came out at the start of COVID, and this book's come out in the midst of the most horrific war we've ever seen. Not literally seen, because wars have always been horrific, no doubt, but we never saw them before.
Well, the Vietnam War was the living room war, right? That was like it was on your televisions and suddenly people had it in their lounge rooms. Now it's not just your living room, it's every single step that you take throughout the world. You're accompanied by these images of
in
horror
your phone.
And your own feeling of impotence that you can't friggin' stop it.
Yeah. Where is the grace? Because I've never seen a time, I've never experienced a time like this on social media, in media, in the world, where in private people can have conversations, but publicly there is just rage and fury and despair and aggression and awfulness, horror. Where's the grace? Paul Keating, as you wrote, talked about the dark threads in our society and that we have to look to find the golden threads and pull at the golden threads. Where are the golden threads, Julia Baird? Where's the grace in this?
Well, I think part of the problem is we don't see it much on the public stage. We've got like a political class that seems to, in very many occasions, draw on our fears and anxieties and our short-term needs as opposed to long-term thinking about future generations, about other people. And just the polarisation and the role of social media has absolutely eroded our ability to see the better in each other and see any kind of good in an opponent. You think about John Lewis, the civil rights leader, and he said that he used to think in these marches in the 60s and the 70s, and he would see these faces in the crowd yelling at him, these kind of the faces of racism, and how confronting and dark that is. And he just said he would try to think to himself, that person was a baby once. Like, what has happened to that person to get them to that point? Which is why I think we have to really fundamentally listen very hard to each other to break up some of that polarisation stuff.
It's very hard to listen to someone when they're screaming at you, though.
It is. And it becomes a mental health issue because a lot of what I've written about is about what is there to hold on to when life is really difficult, and what is it that keeps us going. And I talk about Roy Kent from Ted Lasso. Did you see Ted Lasso?
Yep.
Brett Goldstein, who plays him, says that he went to see a film that was really horrific with a friend of his, and I think it was like a prolonged assault or sexual assault, and it was gruesome and it was unrelenting and it was lengthy. And he came out and he was like, so that is entertainment, hey? He's like, the thing is, he decided it was bad art because there is always, in the midst of horror and ugliness and distemper and all the foul things, there's always a moment of humour or a moment of connection or a moment when people hold each other, albeit briefly. And I think that's really important, and we don't really see enough of that even in the media, when things work, because we're so intent on uncovering the horror, of course. And you also can't look away from it because we need to stop it.
Anger is energising too, and you've written about
anger's
that.
Important.
Anger is important, but it can also be a diversion and an escape and a crutch, because anger, I think, certainly on social media, can make you feel like you're doing something. In actual fact, you're not. And I would say the same of piling onto someone in some cases, that kind of just mindless shouting. And no, I shouldn't say mindless because people feel passionate. I get that.
Yeah.
But I saw it in COVID as well. It's easier to be angry than scared. It's easier to be angry than sorrowful. It's easier to be angry than despairing. And I think that anger does not allow room for grace to squeeze in.
Yeah. And again, why kind of would you? But I think we have to, when we look at some of the horrors currently being committed, but when you think about what is it we're actually fighting for, what is it we actually all share in common, what is the definition of our basic humanity? Right now, obviously in the Middle East, like, it is beyond words. And I understand the desperation and the anger, and because it's like the gates of hell have opened up.
Yeah, it feels that way.
Right. So you don't want to come in and go, have some daisies and some Kleenex and this is all about grace. It's not that. But I have noticed that grace can emerge in times of massive dislocation and pain, and it gives us something to hold on to. We will see the helpers. You will see people that resist and that fight and that speak up. To even bring in the question of forgiveness can be seen as very glib. You have to just remember, I don't know what it is. I mean, I think a lot of the suffragette stuff, when they talk about we fight for not just bread but roses too, and it's you want
that's beautiful,
right?
Yeah,
we want equality and justice and fairness, and but every human also deserves leisure and art and beauty
and grace.
And one of the greatest forms of beauty is moral beauty. And we have to somehow enable the peacemakers. We just have to work out how we can do that.
When I was thinking about this conversation today, and I was scrolling through the horror that we talked about, I came across this post. So it's this man who has family who were taken hostage by Hamas in Israel and are now being held in Gaza. And he lives in New York, and he wrote, "I woke up this morning with rage after seeing the video of someone tearing down posters of my family. I immediately got out of bed and started replacing the posters that were torn down on Bedford Avenue. As I was putting up a poster, a Muslim Palestinian man came up to me and told me he wants peace. He started the conversation by saying he does not agree with Hamas and wishes they would be eradicated. He explained to me the pain and suffering his people have gone through because of Hamas. I ended up telling him that I was putting up posters of my kidnapped family members, and we had a 30-minute conversation about my family and the conflict. We agreed on almost everything. After our conversation, he found me again and brought me a meal he had bought for me. He said it was sadaqah, which we call tzedakah in Hebrew. At the end, I told him salam, and he told me shalom. Sometimes when you feel like there is no humanity left on this earth, it presents itself in the most surprising ways."
Right. That's such a beautiful example. It
Yeah.
was like, remember that elderly woman who'd been a hostage, and as she was walking out, she grabs the hands of the men who we can't even see their faces. They've got the balaclavas on from Hamas, and she just says, shalom, after everything she's been through. That is the triumph of a human spirit. That is how we enable the peacemakers when we look at what people are capable of. Otherwise, why would we bother? If we're only here on earth to just tear each other apart. And the reason we're so distressed to our cause is because it's just not the way it should be.
Wasn't that like soothing balm? Julia's new book is called Bright Shining. It's already a bestseller, and you can check it out if you click the link in our show notes. It's a great gift and it's a great read, particularly over summer when you just need a little bit of respite and maybe a bit of re-inspiration. The executive producer of No Filter is Kimberly Bradish, with sound production by Madeline Joannou. I'm Mia Friedman, and thank you for having me in your ears.